I don't know my real name. For 13 years, my family called me Spare. My parents told the world they had triplets. They told the insurance company they had triplets. They collected $2. 8 million because they had triplets. They had quadruplets. I lived in the basement. No birth certificate. No school. No doctor visits except the ones my mother performed herself, drawing my blood, running tests, keeping a file by my mattress that I wasn't supposed to read. I read it. Universal donor. Perfect organ match. I wasn't their daughter. I was a contingency plan. An insurance policy made of flesh and bone in case my sisters ever needed. Parts. For 13 years, I thought this was love. I thought hiding meant protection. I thought the blood draws were normal. Then one of my sisters got sick, and my father started coming to the basement more often, looking at me differently, measuring something I couldn't name. My sisters figured it out before I did. On our 13th birthday, they came for me at 3 a.m. Glass shattered. 4 identical girls stood on the front lawn for the first time in our lives. The neighbors started counting. My mother's face went white. Here's what happened. The sirens cut through the quiet street before I understood what they meant. Red and blue lights washed over us in waves that made my eyes water and my head pound. I tried to count the police cars, but the numbers got mixed up in my brain and I had to stop. 2 officers ran toward us across the grass while another one talked into a radio clipped to her shoulder. My legs wouldn't hold me up anymore, and I started to sink toward the ground, but my sisters caught me before I fell. They made a circle around me with their bodies pressed close together, and I could feel them shaking the same way I was shaking. One of the officers stopped a few feet away and held up both hands like he was trying to calm down a scared animal. He asked if we were hurt, and Melody said I was bleeding from the broken window. The officer looked at the cuts on my arms and legs and called for the paramedics who were getting equipment out of the ambulance that just pulled up. The flashing lights kept hurting my eyes in a way that made my stomach feel sick. I'd never seen lights this bright except on the monitors in the basement when my sisters watched movies, and even those didn't compare to this. Everything was too loud and too bright and too open, and I wanted to go back underground where it was dark and quiet, but I also never wanted to see that basement again. The paramedics tried to move my sisters away from me so they could check my injuries, but Melody's hand gripped mine so tight it hurt. She kept saying the same words over and over in a voice that got louder each time. That I was their sister, that I'd been in the basement their whole lives, that our parents kept me hidden. The paramedic with the medical bag looked confused and asked Melody what she meant about a basement. Melody pointed at the house and said, "I lived down there for 13 years with no windows and no door to the outside." The paramedic's face changed and she turned to look at her partner, and they had a conversation without words, just by looking at each other. The lead officer walked over and asked Melody to repeat what she just said. Melody told him everything while Katya and our other sister nodded and added details about the monitors and the medical equipment and how our parents said I didn't exist. The officer's jaw got tight and he pulled out his radio and said something about Child Protective Services and possible imprisonment of a minor. My mother stood in the front doorway in her bathrobe with her arms crossed over her chest. She didn't say anything or move or even look directly at us. My father came out behind her and started yelling about warrants and illegal entry and how the police had no right to be on his property. The officer told him to step back inside the house and my father's face turned red, but he stopped yelling. A female officer came over with a blanket that smelled like something sharp and chemical that I'd never smelled before. She wrapped it around my shoulders and it felt scratchy against my skin but also warm. She knelt down so her face was level with mine and asked me my name in a soft voice. I opened my mouth and the word came out automatically. Spare. She wrote it down in a small notebook and I watched her pen move across the paper. Then she looked up at my mother and her expression changed into something hard and cold. My mother's face stayed blank for a few seconds, and then she finally spoke. She said my legal name wasn't on any documents because I was never born according to official records. The officer asked what she meant, and my mother explained that only 3 births were registered with the state. The officer's hand tightened on her pen, and she asked my mother if she was saying I didn't legally exist. My mother nodded once and went back to staring at nothing. The officer stood up fast and walked over to the lead officer, and they talked in low voices while looking back at me. More police cars arrived and officers started putting up yellow tape around the front yard. Neighbors came out of their houses in pajamas and robes to watch what was happening. I heard one woman counting out loud as she pointed at me and my sisters. 1, 2, 3, 4. She said it twice like she couldn't believe what she was seeing. A silver car pulled up at exactly 4:30 according to the clock on the ambulance dashboard that I could see from where I sat on the grass. A woman got out carrying a large bag and a camera, and she walked straight toward us without stopping to talk to the police first. She showed her badge to the officer and said her name was Heather Moss from Child Protective Services. She looked at me and her face got very still and quiet like she was trying not to show what she was thinking. She asked the officer if anyone had documented my injuries yet, and the officer said the paramedics were waiting for permission to examine me. Heather said she needed to take photos first for evidence. She pulled out her camera and took pictures of my arms where the needle marks made lines up and down my skin. She took pictures of my legs that looked too thin and my skin that looked too white. She took pictures of my face and my hands and the cuts from the broken window glass. Each flash made me blink and turn away, but she kept taking more pictures. When she finished, she put the camera back in her bag and knelt down in front of me. She asked if I could stand up and walk a few steps. I tried to push myself up off the ground, but my legs felt like they were made of water. Melody helped me get to my feet, and I took one step forward and then another. On the third step, my knee gave out and I fell. Heather caught me before I hit the ground and called out that she needed an ambulance transport immediately. My father came back outside and said I was fine and just needed to rest, that there was no reason to take me anywhere. Heather turned to look at him and told him to go back inside his house, or she would have the police remove him. Her voice didn't get loud, but something about it made my father stop talking and go back through the door. The hospital was the brightest place I'd ever been in my life. The lights on the ceiling burned into my eyes and made colored spots dance across my vision. Machines beeped in different tones and rhythms that I couldn't predict or understand. People in scrubs and white coats touched my arms and shoulders and back while asking questions I didn't know how to answer. A nurse stuck a needle in my arm to start an IV, and I didn't even flinch because needles were normal and expected. She noticed that I didn't react and wrote something down on her clipboard. Another nurse asked me to rate my pain on a scale from 1 to 10, but I didn't understand what the numbers meant. How could pain be a number? She showed me a chart with faces ranging from smiling to crying and asked me to point to the one that matched how I felt. I pointed to the middle face because I didn't know if my pain was big or small compared to other people's pain. Someone brought in the medical file I'd grabbed from the basement before we escaped. I'd shoved it under my shirt and held onto it during the whole thing on the lawn. A nurse picked it up from where it fell on the floor and started reading through the pages. Her face went white like all the blood drained out of it. She called over a doctor and showed him something on one of the pages. The doctor read it and his mouth made a thin, straight line. He asked me where I got this file, and I told him it was by my mattress in the basement. He asked if my mother wrote it, and I said yes. He turned to a page near the back and read out loud the words, "Organ Harvest Timeline." The room got very quiet except for the beeping machines. The nurse put her hand over her mouth and left the room fast. The doctors ran tests that took hours and involved more needles and machines that made loud noises. They took blood from my arm and said they needed to check for vitamin deficiencies and anemia. They did an x-ray of my bones and said my muscle development was not normal for someone my age. A doctor with gray hair examined the needle marks on my arms and counted them out loud. 23 on the left arm, 19 on the right arm. He measured how far apart they were and took notes about their pattern and depth. He asked me how often my mother drew my blood, and I tried to remember, but the days in the basement all blurred together. Maybe once a week, maybe more. He wrote that down and moved on to examining my legs and back. Another doctor came in with papers that showed test results. She said I had severe vitamin D deficiency from never being in sunlight, that I was anemic from repeated blood draws, that my muscles had atrophy from not being used properly during the years when they should have been growing. She said the blood tests also showed evidence of tissue typing procedures that had no medical reason, except to check compatibility for organ donation. The gray-haired doctor nodded and added that the pattern of tests matched what someone would do if they were preparing a donor for harvest. He said the word harvest like it was something you did to corn or wheat, not people. The doctors talked to each other using medical words I only half understood from reading my file. They kept looking at me with expressions that made me feel like I was something broken that needed to be fixed. My sisters got taken to a different part of the hospital to be interviewed by a detective. I wanted to go with them, but the nurses said I needed to stay in the examination room for more tests. A man in a suit came in and introduced himself as Detective Jeremy Pike. He had a notebook like the officer from earlier, and a recording device that he set on the table between us. He asked if it was okay to record our conversation, and I said yes because I didn't know I could say no. He started with easy questions about my name and age, and then moved to harder ones about the basement. I told him about the mattress and the bucket and the monitors that showed me what my sisters were doing upstairs. I told him about the medical file and the blood draws and the tests my mother ran. I told him about watching my father come down the stairs more often after Katya got sick. How he looked at me different, like he was figuring out measurements or timing. Detective Pike wrote everything down, and his face stayed calm and professional, but his hand gripped the pen tighter as I talked. He asked if I understood what my parents were planning to do with me. I said yes. They were going to take my kidney for Katya because I was a perfect match. He asked if anyone ever explained this to me directly, and I said no, but I read it in the file. He asked if I knew that what my parents did was illegal and wrong. I said I was starting to understand that now, but for a long time I thought it was normal, because it was the only life I knew. Detective Pike left to interview my sisters, and I got moved to a hospital room on the 3rd floor. A social worker came in while the nurses were getting me settled in the bed. She had brown hair pulled back in a ponytail, and she sat in the chair next to my bed. She said her name, but I forgot it immediately, because too many people had told me their names today. She explained that I would need to stay in protective custody, while they investigated my parents. I asked what investigate meant if the evidence was right there in the medical file and the basement, and the fact that I existed when I wasn't supposed to. She said legal processes take time, and they need to build a case that will hold up in court. That they need to gather all the evidence and interview everyone and make sure everything is documented properly. She said my parents would be arrested and charged with crimes, but the exact charges would depend on what the investigation found. I asked what would happen to my sisters, and she said they would be placed with a relative temporarily while the case moved forward. I asked if I could go with them, and she paused before answering. She said I needed specialized care that a regular family placement couldn't provide right now, that I would go to a different facility where they had staff trained to help children who had been through extreme situations. The word different made my chest feel tight. The word separated made it worse. My sisters came to say goodbye the next afternoon. Heather had decided they would stay with their maternal aunt starting that night. I was transferred to a group home for children in protective custody the following morning. We sat in my hospital room and nobody knew what to say. Katya kept apologizing and I kept telling her it wasn't her fault, but she wouldn't stop. Melody held my hand like she was afraid I would disappear if she let go. Our other sister sat in the corner chair and cried quietly. A nurse knocked and said it was time for them to leave. Melody's hand tightened on mine and she asked if she could stay just a little longer. The nurse said no, the social worker was waiting downstairs. My sisters stood up slowly like their bodies were heavy. They each hugged me and promised they would visit as soon as they were allowed. I watched them walk out the door and down the hallway until they turned the corner and I couldn't see them anymore. The room felt too big and too empty and too quiet. I pulled the blanket up over my head and cried for the first time since we stood on the lawn. I cried for the basement and the life I thought I had. I cried for my sisters who felt guilty about things they couldn't control. I cried because being rescued was supposed to feel better than this. But instead, it felt like I'd traded one kind of cage for another. The crying made my chest hurt and my throat raw, but I couldn't stop. A nurse came in and asked if I needed anything. I said I wanted my sisters back. She said they would visit soon. I said soon wasn't the same as now. She didn't have an answer for that. The physical therapy room had windows that went from floor to ceiling, and the sunlight made me squint, even though it wasn't very bright outside. A man with gray hair and a kind face introduced himself as Tomas and asked if I was ready to start working on getting stronger. He explained everything before he did it, showing me the exercises first on himself, and when he needed to adjust my posture, he always asked permission before touching my shoulder or arm. We started with standing up from a chair without using my hands, which seemed easy until I tried it and my legs shook so bad I had to grab the armrests. So Thomas said that was normal for someone whose muscles hadn't been used properly, and we practiced it 10 more times until I could do it twice without shaking. Next, he had me walk across the room while he watched how I moved, and he pointed out that I leaned too far forward and didn't swing my arms right. He showed me how to walk with better posture, and we practiced back and forth until my legs hurt, and I asked to sit down. Thomas said we made good progress for day 1 and scheduled 3 more sessions for the week. The next morning, a woman with short black hair came to my room and said she was the hospital psychiatrist. She asked me questions about what I remembered from the basement, what my sisters taught me, and how I felt about being in the hospital now. I told her about the books Melody brought me and how I learned to read from watching educational programs on the monitor, and her eyebrows went up when I used words like photosynthesis and democracy. She wrote notes on her tablet and said my vocabulary was better than most kids my age, but then she asked me what friendship meant, and I didn't have a good answer because I'd never had a friend besides my sisters. She asked me to describe different emotions, and I could name them from books, but couldn't always explain when someone would feel them in real life. She said we would work on social understanding and emotional processing, which sounded like more tests, but she promised it would help me understand people better. Detective Pike returned on my 3rd day with a recording device and a notebook. He set up the recorder on the table next to my bed and asked if I understood that he was going to record our conversation about what happened in the basement. I said yes, and he pressed the red button. He asked me to start from my earliest memories, and I told him about waking up on the mattress, about the bucket in the corner, about my mother coming down the stairs with her medical bag. I described the blood draws and how she would mark the date and time in the file, how she ran tests on the samples using equipment she kept on metal shelves. He asked about the monitors, and I explained how I could see my sisters in different rooms, how I learned their schedules and routines, how I knew when they were at the school, or eating dinner, or sleeping. Detective Pike's face stayed calm the whole time, but his hand gripped the pen tighter. When I talked about my father measuring me after Katya got sick, about how he would stand at the bottom of the stairs and stare at me like he was doing math in his head, the detective asked if anyone ever told me directly what they planned to do, and I said no, but the file made it clear enough. He thanked me for my statement and said it would help build the case against my parents. 2 days later, Heather came to tell me my parents had been arrested. She sat in the chair next to my bed and explained the charges, using simple words when the legal terms got too complicated. Insurance fraud because they lied about having triplets to get more money. Child endangerment because keeping me in the basement hurt my health and development. Unlawful imprisonment because I wasn't allowed to leave. Conspiracy to commit assault with intent to harvest organs because of what they plan to do with my kidney. The bail hearing happened fast, and the judge set the amount really high because my parents might try to run away, so they had to stay in jail while their lawyer prepared their defense. Heather said the trial would take months, and I would probably have to testify, which made my stomach hurt just thinking about it. After 7 days in the hospital, the doctors said I was healthy enough to leave. Heather drove me to a group home in a neighborhood with small houses and chain-link fences. Inside, there were 6 other kids ranging from maybe 8 years old to 16, and they all stopped what they were doing to stare at me when I walked in. A staff member named Rita showed me to a bedroom I would share with 2 other girls and explained the house rules about chores and meal times and quiet hours. The other kids kept staring at my pale skin and the way I jumped when someone dropped a book in the next room. At dinner, I sat at the table and didn't know which fork to use or how much food to take, and Rita had to show me quietly so the other kids wouldn't laugh. That night, I tried to take a shower but couldn't figure out how to adjust the temperature and ended up standing under cold water until Rita heard me crying and came to help. She was patient when I asked stupid questions about shampoo and soap and how long I was supposed to stay in there. Heather visited on Tuesday and Friday of my first week at the group home. She brought papers about the legal case and explained that the prosecutor was focusing on the insurance fraud because it was easier to prove than some of the other charges. I got angry and asked why they weren't focusing on what my parents did to me, on the 13 years in the basement and the plan to take my organs. Heather said the fraud was documented in bank records and insurance claims that couldn't be argued with, while abuse cases were harder because my parents could make up excuses, and it turned into my word against theirs. She promised my parents would still go to prison for a long time, even if the fraud charges were the main focus. I didn't like it, but I understood that legal stuff was complicated, and sometimes you had to be strategic about which crimes you could prove. My sisters got permission to visit me in week 3. A social worker brought them to the group home, and we sat in the common room with windows that actually opened and doors that weren't locked. Seeing them in a normal room with sunlight and furniture felt wrong somehow, like we were breaking a rule by being together outside the basement. We sat on the couch and nobody knew what to say at first. Melody asked if I was okay and I said yes, even though I wasn't sure what okay meant anymore. Katya apologized again for getting sick, and I told her again it wasn't her fault, but she kept crying anyway. Our other sister showed me a drawing she made in art class, and I pretended to understand what it meant. The social worker said we had an hour, and we spent most of it sitting in awkward silence because we'd never been sisters anywhere except in secret, and learning how to talk to each other with other people watching was harder than I expected. The next week, Melody brought her backpack full of schoolwork. She spread out textbooks and worksheets on the table and showed me what they were learning in 8th grade. Math problems with algebra and equations that looked nothing like the basic arithmetic she'd taught me. Science chapters about cells and ecosystems that went way deeper than the simple facts I'd memorized. History lessons about wars and governments that I'd never heard of because my knowledge came from whatever books my sisters could smuggle to the basement. Looking at their homework made me realize how much I'd missed even with their help. Reading was one thing, but understanding history required knowing about the world, and science needed experiments and observations I'd never been able to do. Melody saw my face and promised they would help me catch up, but the gap between what I knew and what I needed to know felt impossible to cross. Katya's health got worse during my 4th week at the group home. Heather told me during her Friday visit that Katya's doctors wanted to put her on the transplant waiting list through the official system. At our next visit, Katya cried and said she felt guilty that her kidney problems caused everything that happened. I had to explain that our parents made their choices long before she got sick, that they'd been planning to use me from the day I was born, that her illness just gave them a reason to act on what they always intended to do. She kept saying she was sorry, and I kept saying it wasn't her fault until the social worker said our time was up. A man from the prosecutor's office came to interview me specifically about the insurance fraud. He asked detailed questions about what I overheard my parents saying and what documents were in the medical file. I described the papers that showed they told the insurance company they had triplets, that triplets were worth $2.8 million because multiple births were high risk. I explained that quadruplets only got $50,000 because they were so rare the insurance companies had different rules, so my parents hid me to get the bigger payout. The money paid for the house with the basement where they kept me, paid for my sister's private school, paid for the medical equipment my mother used to run tests on me. He recorded everything and said this evidence would be central to the prosecution's case. I asked if the insurance company would want their money back, and he said probably, but that wasn't my problem to worry about. The prosecutor's investigator left me with a folder full of documents to review, asking me to mark anything that looked familiar from the basement. I spent 2 hours going through pages of insurance claims, bank statements, and medical supply orders, while Rita sat nearby doing paperwork of her own. My parents had documented everything, keeping receipts for syringes and blood collection tubes and tissue typing kits, and seeing the evidence of 13 years organized into neat columns of numbers made my stomach hurt in a different way than remembering the actual needle sticks did. Court documents became public 3 weeks after my parents' arrest. Heather called to warn me before it happened, explaining that reporters would start covering the case, and I might see news vans in the neighborhood. She promised to keep my face and real location private, but said the basic facts would spread quickly once journalists got access to the legal filings. The next morning, Rita showed me a newspaper headline that read, "Hidden Quadruplet Case Shocks Community," with a photo of my parents' house and a blurred image of 4 girls that must have been taken the night we escaped. The article described me as the 4th identical sister kept in a basement for insurance fraud purposes, and reading about my life in newspaper language felt surreal and wrong, even though every fact was true. By afternoon, the local news stations were running stories, and within 2 days, national outlets picked it up because apparently hiding a child for 13 years to commit fraud was interesting enough for cable news. Heather visited that evening to check on me and found me watching a legal expert on television discuss my case without knowing I was the actual person he was analyzing. He kept calling it unprecedented and complex, using words like exploitation and premeditation that I understood but wished I didn't have to apply to my own parents. My parents' lawyer filed motions during week 4 arguing that everything they did was protective, not harmful. Heather brought me copies of the legal documents because she thought I should know what lies they were telling, and I read my mother's sworn statement claiming I had a severe immune disorder that required isolation from other children and regular medical monitoring. The motion described the basement as a controlled environment necessary for my safety, and the blood draws as standard procedure for tracking my fabricated condition. I got angry reading it because my mother knew I could read her medical files, knew I'd seen the words universal donor and organ harvest timeline written in her own handwriting, and now she was pretending those documents meant something completely different. The prosecutor filed a response 2 days later, with expert testimony from 3 doctors who reviewed my actual medical records and found 0 evidence of any immune disorder or condition requiring isolation. They explained that tissue typing and compatibility testing had no therapeutic purpose and were only performed when preparing for organ transplantation, and their professional opinions destroyed my parents' protection argument in language even I could understand without Heather's help. Week 5 started with Heather telling me I was moving to a different placement. She sat in the common room and explained that the group home was good for short-term crisis care, but I needed more specialized support than the rotating staff could provide. Aisha Marshall ran a therapeutic foster home for kids with severe trauma backgrounds, and she had an opening in a house with only 2 other children instead of 6. I didn't want to move because I'd just started figuring out the group home routines, but Heather promised this change would help me feel safer, and Aisha knew how to work with kids who'd experienced things most people couldn't imagine. The move happened on Tuesday afternoon with everything I owned fitting into 2 garbage bags that Rita helped me pack. Aisha met us at her front door. A woman maybe 40 years old with kind eyes and a calm voice that didn't change volume even when I dropped one of my bags and spilled clothes across her porch. Her house had schedules posted on every wall showing meal times, quiet hours, and therapy appointments, and she walked me through each routine slowly while explaining that structure helped traumatized brains feel more secure. My room had a bed with a real frame instead of just a mattress on the floor, a window with curtains I could close, and a door that locked from the inside with a key she handed me without making me ask for it. Physical therapy continued at the hospital 3 times a week with Thomas driving me there himself instead of making me take a medical transport van. On Thursday, he celebrated when I walked up a full flight of stairs without stopping to rest, and the next week I stood for 10 minutes during an exercise without my legs shaking. My body was slowly building strength that should have developed naturally over 13 years of normal childhood activity, and Thomas explained each small victory like it mattered, even though I knew I was just catching up to where I should have been years ago. He measured my progress in charts and graphs that showed improvement in muscle tone and endurance, but he also warned me that some effects of the confinement would be permanent. My bone density was lower than normal for my age, my cardiovascular system hadn't developed properly from lack of activity, and I would probably always have limitations that my sisters didn't face. Hearing him say permanent made me angry at my parents in a new way, because even if I spent the rest of my life working to fix what they did, some damage couldn't be undone no matter how hard I tried. The preliminary hearing happened in month 2 on a cold morning when Aisha drove me to the courthouse in her reliable sedan. Heather met us at the entrance and walked me through security, explaining that this hearing was just to determine if there was enough evidence to proceed to trial and I wouldn't have to testify today. We sat in the gallery while the prosecutor presented documents and witness statements to the judge, and I tried to focus on the legal arguments instead of staring at my parents sitting at the defense table 15 feet away. My mother kept her eyes down the entire time, studying her hands like they contained answers to questions nobody was asking. But my father turned around twice to look directly at me with an expression I recognized from the basement. He was calculating something, measuring possibilities, doing math in his head about outcomes and consequences, and I realized he wasn't looking at me as his daughter, but as a problem he needed to solve. The judge took 30 minutes to review the evidence before ruling there was sufficient cause to proceed to trial, and my father's face stayed blank while my mother finally looked up with tears that might have been real or might have been performance for the court. Heather started working on getting me legal documentation the week after the preliminary hearing because I couldn't access basic services without proof I existed. She explained the complicated process of establishing my identity when there was no birth certificate, no hospital records, no paper trail showing I was born at all. We needed court orders to create documentation from nothing, and that required multiple hearings where witnesses would testify about my existence, and DNA tests would prove my relationship to my sisters. The whole system was designed around the assumption that every person had documents from birth, and trying to insert myself into that system 13 years late created problems nobody knew how to solve efficiently. Heather filed petitions in family court requesting emergency documentation so I could eventually get a social security number, and she warned me this process would take months because bureaucracy moved slowly, even in unusual cases. My sisters visited more often now that I lived at Aisha's house instead of the chaotic group home. They came every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, and we sat in the living room working on understanding how different our experiences had been despite living in the same house. Melody talked about birthday parties and school field trips and summer camps, while I tried not to feel jealous about the normal childhood she got to have. Katya described her friends and teachers and the drama club she joined, and I struggled with anger I didn't want to feel toward the only people who ever cared about me. They felt guilty for having normal lives while I was hidden in the basement, and I resented them for that normalcy, even though I knew my parents' choices weren't their fault. Aisha sat with us during these visits, helping us navigate the complicated feelings that came with being sisters who barely knew each other, despite sharing identical DNA and 13 years in the same building. A family court judge made a preliminary ruling about permanent placement during week 7. Heather explained the decision before we went to court so I wouldn't be surprised, but hearing it officially still hurt in ways I didn't expect. My sisters could be placed with their maternal aunt who wanted to adopt them and give them stability after everything that happened, but I needed to remain in specialized foster care because my trauma and developmental delays required support their aunt couldn't provide. The separation made sense logically because Aisha had training and experience their aunt didn't have, but it felt like another punishment for being the one who was kept in the basement. I started having nightmares about being left behind again, about my sisters moving on with their normal lives while I stayed trapped in systems designed for broken kids. Aisha found me crying at 3 in the morning after one of these dreams and sat with me until sunrise, explaining that needing extra support didn't mean I was less important or less loved than my sisters. Educational testing happened over 3 days in week 8 with specialists who asked me to read passages, solve math problems, and answer questions about history and science. The results showed I was reading at 10th grade level thanks to all the books my sisters smuggled to the basement. But my math skills topped out around 5th grade, and my science knowledge had huge gaps because I'd never done experiments or observations. Social studies was worse because understanding history required knowing about the world, and my world had been one room with concrete walls and no windows for 13 years. The testing coordinator met with Aisha and me to explain they were creating a customized learning plan that would acknowledge both my abilities and my deficits, and a team of tutors would start working with me individually to help me catch up. Looking at the assessment results made me realize how much I'd missed even with my sister's help, and the gap between what I knew and what I needed to know felt impossible to cross. The prosecutor visited Aisha's house during week 9 to discuss a plea deal she'd offered my parents. She sat at the kitchen table and explained that she'd proposed they plead guilty to insurance fraud and child endangerment in exchange for dropping the more serious charges and recommending sentences that would run at the same time instead of one after another. Their lawyer advised them to take it because the evidence was strong and a trial risked much longer prison time. But my father refused to accept any deal that required admitting wrongdoing. The prosecutor seemed frustrated when she told me this, explaining that my father insisted they did nothing wrong and were protecting me from a dangerous world that wouldn't understand my special needs. She asked if I wanted to write a victim statement that might convince them to reconsider. But I didn't know what words could make my father see that keeping me in a basement for 13 years wasn't protection, no matter what lies he told himself to sleep at night. I wrote the letter declining Uncle Gary's meeting request, but Heather brought him to the foster home anyway 3 days later. She knocked on my bedroom door and said someone wanted to meet me. And when I came downstairs, a man who looked like my father, except older and softer, stood in Aisha's living room holding a stuffed elephant. He said his name was Gary, and he was sorry he didn't know sooner, that my father always had explanations when he asked about the basement renovations, or the soundproofing, or why they never had a 4th daughter at family gatherings. His voice shook when he talked, and I watched his hands squeeze the elephant's trunk over and over, while he explained he suspected something felt wrong, but trusted his brother's answers because family members don't usually hide children in basements. I didn't say anything for 5 minutes, and Aisha sat beside me on the couch waiting for me to decide how I felt about this man who shared my father's DNA, and maybe could have saved me if he'd asked better questions. Finally, I told him I didn't know if I wanted his help, because help 13 years ago would have meant something. But help now just felt like guilt trying to fix itself, and his face crumpled. But he nodded and left the elephant on the coffee table before Heather walked him back to his car. The therapist's office had soft lighting and chairs that didn't match, and a box of tissues on every surface like she expected people to cry constantly. She asked me to describe a normal day in the basement, and I listed the routine of waking up, doing exercises my sisters taught me, reading books, waiting for visits, and she stopped me to ask if I thought that sounded like love. I said yes because my parents kept me safe from the dangerous world, and she pulled out photos of other children my age at parks, at schools, at birthday parties, asking if those children looked unsafe or unloved. The pictures confused me because I'd seen my sisters in similar photos, but never understood that other families didn't keep spare children in basements just in case. And the therapist said very gently that protection means teaching someone to handle the world, not hiding them from it completely. We spent an hour going through examples of what parents normally do versus what mine did, and every comparison made my chest feel tight because I kept wanting to defend their choices even while knowing the defense didn't make sense. She gave me homework to write down 3 things my parents did that I thought were normal, and 3 things I now recognized as wrong. And walking back to Aisha's car, I couldn't stop thinking about how 13 years of believing something doesn't disappear just because someone shows you different pictures. Melody brought a photo album to the house on Thursday afternoon, and Katya carried a second one, and they spread the pictures across Aisha's dining room table like evidence in a trial. Birthday parties with cakes shaped like princesses and castles, school concerts where they wore matching dresses, family vacations to beaches where they built sand castles and collected shells, Christmas mornings with presents stacked under trees I never knew existed in our house. I picked up a photo from their 8th birthday, showing all 3 of them wearing crowns and blowing out candles. While my parents smiled in the background and the date stamp said I'd been in the basement during this exact moment, probably doing exercises or reading a book my sisters smuggled down the week before. Melody pointed to another picture from a science fair where she'd won 2nd place for a project about plant growth, and I realized she'd learned about photosynthesis and soil composition while teaching me basic addition from a textbook she stole from the school. Every image showed them living full, complicated lives with friends and teachers and experiences, while I existed in one room with concrete walls and a mattress and a medical file that defined my only purpose. The pain felt different from physical hurt, something that started in my stomach, and spread through my chest until I couldn't breathe properly. And when Melody saw my face, she started crying and saying she was sorry over and over, even though the photos weren't her fault. The prosecutor called Aisha's house during week 10 to schedule trial preparation meetings, and I threw up in the bathroom after hanging up the phone. She wanted to meet twice a week for the next month to help me practice answering questions about the basement, about the medical tests, about what I understood regarding why my parents kept me hidden. The idea of speaking in front of strangers while my parents sat 15 feet away listening made my hands shake so badly I couldn't hold a glass of water without spilling it. Aisha drove me to the prosecutor's office on Tuesday morning, and the woman had kind eyes but asked horrible questions about whether my mother explained what the blood draws were for and whether my father ever discussed what would happen if my sisters got sick. I tried to answer honestly but kept stumbling over words because talking about the basement out loud to someone who would repeat it in court made the experience feel more real than it had while living through it. The prosecutor recorded my responses and said we'd practice until I could speak clearly and calmly because the jury needed to understand what happened without getting distracted by my emotions. And I wanted to ask how anyone could hear about a child kept in a basement for organ harvesting without feeling emotional. But I understood she meant I needed to be functional enough to communicate facts. Heather called with news about Katya in month 3, her voice excited when she explained that an anonymous donor kidney had become available through the official transplant list. The surgery was scheduled for the following week and would prove that our parents' claims about needing my organs urgently were complete lies, since the medical system could provide what Katya needed without harvesting parts from me. I asked if I could visit her before the surgery, but Heather said the hospital had strict rules about who could be in transplant patient rooms, and I wasn't legally her sister yet, according to the documentation that still didn't exist. The surgery took 6 hours and went well, according to the text message Melody sent. And 3 days later, Katya was awake and recovering when Heather finally got permission for me to visit for 20 minutes. She looked tired, but her color was better than I'd seen through the basement monitors, and she held my hand while saying she was going to spend her second chance at life, making sure I got a real first chance at mine. I didn't know what a first chance looked like for someone who'd already lived 13 years, but her determination made me think maybe it wasn't too late to figure out who I could become when I wasn't just spare parts waiting to be used. The pre-trial hearing happened in month 4, and I sat in the gallery with Heather while lawyers argued about whether the medical file I'd grabbed during the escape could be used as evidence. My parents' lawyer stood up and claimed I'd obtained the file illegally by taking it without permission when we broke the basement window, arguing that stolen evidence shouldn't be allowed in court even if it documented crimes. The prosecutor responded by saying I had a fundamental right to documentation about my own body and medical procedures performed on me without consent, and taking my own medical records couldn't be theft when I was the patient those records described. The judge listened to both arguments, then ruled the file was admissible because children have rights to information about their own healthcare, regardless of how they obtain that information. And the small victory felt important even though I didn't completely understand the legal reasoning behind distinguishing between stealing evidence and reclaiming personal documentation. My father's lawyer looked angry when the judge made the ruling, and my mother stared at her hands the entire time like she could find answers in the lines on her palms. Aisha started teaching me to cook simple meals during week 11, standing beside me in the kitchen while I learned to boil pasta and heat sauce from a jar. She showed me how to crack eggs without getting shells in the bowl, how to measure ingredients using cups and spoons, how to tell when meat was cooked through by checking its color and texture. Every task felt complicated because I'd never used a stove or handled knives or opened a refrigerator to choose my own food, and twice I burned myself on hot pans because I didn't understand how long metal stayed hot after you turned off the burner. Laundry was worse because the machines had so many buttons and settings, and I couldn't figure out why you needed different temperatures for different clothes, or what fabric softener actually softened. Aisha never acted frustrated when I asked basic questions about why towels and shirts couldn't wash together, or how much detergent to use. And her patience helped me trust that not all adults would punish me for not knowing things I should have learned gradually over 13 years. She taught me about personal hygiene routines like brushing teeth twice daily, and washing hair every few days, and changing clothes regularly, explaining these weren't just rules but ways to take care of myself that everyone learned as children. I realized my mother had controlled even these basic aspects of my existence, deciding when I was clean enough or what clothes I wore, and learning to make these tiny choices for myself felt like practicing a kind of freedom I didn't know existed. The trial started in month 5 on a Monday morning when Aisha drove me to the courthouse, and Heather met us at the security entrance. The courtroom had wood paneling and uncomfortable benches, and too many people sitting in rows watching like this was entertainment instead of my life being examined in public. I sat behind the prosecutor's table where she said I'd be safe and visible to the jury. And my parents entered through a side door wearing clothes that made them look normal and respectable, instead of like people who kept a child in a basement for 13 years. The prosecutor stood up and began presenting evidence, showing the jury photos of the basement with its bare mattress and concrete walls and small barred window, displaying the medical file with its documentation of blood draws and tissue typing and organ compatibility testing. She called expert witnesses who testified about the psychological harm caused by prolonged isolation and the physical effects of confinement on developing bodies. And every piece of evidence felt like watching my life translated into legal language that somehow made it sound both more and less terrible than living through it actually was. My parents showed no emotion during the testimony, sitting still and expressionless like they were watching a boring movie instead of listening to experts describe the damage they'd caused their own daughter. My sisters testified on day 3, and I watched them walk to the witness stand one at a time to answer questions about discovering me during hide and seek when we were 5 years old. Melody described finding the basement door unlocked and seeing me for the first time, how she'd been confused about why there was another girl who looked exactly like her and Katya, and our other sister living in a room with no toys or windows. She explained the secret visits that started after that day, how they'd sneak down whenever our parents left the house or were distracted, bringing food and books and teaching me everything they learned in the school. Katya testified about the fear that grew when she got sick and started hearing our parents discuss her kidney problems in medical terms that sounded like planning instead of worrying, how she'd realized they were waiting for her condition to get bad enough to justify using me as a donor. The prosecutor asked specific questions about whether our parents knew the sisters were visiting me and both Melody, and Katya said yes, that our mother had caught them in the basement multiple times, but only warned them to be quiet and not tell anyone about the 4th sister who didn't officially exist. The neighbors testified on day 4 about never seeing a 4th child at our house, despite living next door for 8 years. One woman described asking my mother about the basement renovations and soundproofing, being told it was for a home theater and music room that would let my father pursue his hobby without disturbing anyone. Another neighbor talked about the night he saw 4 identical girls on the front lawn and called 911 because he'd counted 3 daughters for years, and suddenly there were 4, and something was clearly very wrong. A man who lived across the street admitted he'd heard strange sounds sometimes coming from our house, thuds, and scraping noises that happened at odd hours, but he'd trusted my parents' explanations about storage and home improvement projects because people don't generally assume their neighbors are imprisoning children in basements. The prosecutor asked each neighbor if my parents had ever mentioned having quadruplets instead of triplets, and they all said no, that the story was always 3 daughters who were triplets, and any questions about family size were met with confusion or irritation that suggested the topic was intrusive. The medical expert testified on day 5. A woman with gray hair pulled back tight who spoke in clear, simple terms about what she'd found in my records. She explained how tissue typing worked, how you tested to see if one person's organs would match another person's body, and she said the tests my mother performed had no other reason except to prepare for taking my organs. The courtroom got quiet when she described the blood draws, showing the jury photos of needle marks on arms that looked like mine, explaining how often my mother took blood, and why that frequency wasn't normal for any medical condition, except checking compatibility over and over. She talked about the timeline documented in the file, how the testing increased when my sisters turned 10, then again at 11, and especially after one of them got sick, and her voice stayed calm, but her words made several jurors shift in their seats. The prosecutor asked what would have happened if my sisters hadn't broken the window that night, and the expert paused before saying that based on the progression of tests and the notes about surgical preparation, she believed organ harvesting would have occurred within weeks. My father's lawyer objected, claiming that was speculation, but the judge allowed it because the expert explained her reasoning using the actual documentation my mother kept. The defense tried asking if the tests could have been for monitoring my health, and the expert said no, that healthy children don't need tissue typing and compatibility screening unless someone is planning to use their organs for transplant. She added that the specific tests performed, the frequency, and the detailed notes about matches all pointed to preparation, not protection. And when she finished testifying, I watched 2 jurors wipe their eyes. Day 6 started with the prosecutor telling me it was time for my testimony, and my hands shook while Aisha helped me pick out clothes that looked normal, and not like someone who'd lived in a basement. The courtroom felt smaller when I walked to the witness stand. Every person watching me moved past my parents who sat still as stones at the defense table. The bailiff asked me to swear to tell the truth, and my voice came out quieter than I wanted when I said I would. The prosecutor stood up and smiled at me, the kind of smile that said she knew this was hard, and she started with easy questions about my age and whether I understood why we were here. Then she asked me to describe where I lived for 13 years, and I told the jury about the basement with concrete walls and one small window with bars that let in almost no light. I described the mattress on the floor, the medical supplies my mother kept in plastic bins, the monitors that showed me what my sisters were doing upstairs, and the file that sat beside my mattress with papers about my blood type and tissue matches. The prosecutor asked how often my mother came to the basement, and I said almost every day, sometimes to bring food, sometimes to draw blood, sometimes just to check on me and make sure I wasn't sick. She asked what my mother told me about the blood draws, and I explained that she said it was to keep me healthy, to make sure my body was working right, and I believed her because I didn't know any different. The prosecutor showed me photos of the basement taken after the escape, and I confirmed that was where I slept, where I ate, where I spent every hour of every day for 13 years. She asked if I ever went upstairs, and I said no, that the door stayed locked, and my mother told me the outside world was dangerous for someone like me. The whole time I answered questions, my father stared at me from the defense table, his eyes following every movement, and I forced myself to keep talking even though his stare made my stomach hurt. The prosecutor asked about the medical file, what it said, what I understood it to mean, and I told the jury about reading the words universal donor and perfect organ match, and not understanding at first, but eventually realizing those words meant my body was kept ready in case my sisters needed parts. Several jurors looked angry when I said that, their faces getting tight, and one woman in the back row shook her head slowly. My parents' lawyer stood up for cross-examination, and he started by asking if I felt safe in the basement, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer he wanted. I said no, and he looked surprised, like that wasn't what he expected. He asked why not, if I had food and shelter and medical care, and I told him that safety isn't being locked in a dark room with no name and no purpose except spare parts. I said safety means having choices, knowing people care about you as a person, not just as backup organs, and my voice got stronger as I talked because I'd practiced these ideas with my therapist. The lawyer tried again, asking if my parents ever hurt me physically, and I said the blood draws hurt, the isolation hurt, the knowledge that I only existed as insurance hurt, and hurt doesn't have to mean hitting to be real. He asked if I understood my parents were trying to protect me from a serious immune disorder, and I said no one ever told me I had an immune disorder, that the only papers I saw talked about organ compatibility, not sickness. The prosecutor objected when the defense lawyer kept pushing about protection, and the judge sustained it, telling him to move on. He asked if I loved my parents, and I said I thought I did for a long time, because I didn't know love was supposed to include freedom and identity, and being treated like a whole person instead of spare parts. When he finished, I walked back to my seat behind the prosecutor's table, and Heather squeezed my hand. The prosecution spent day 7 presenting financial records, spreading papers across a table, while an accountant explained what each document showed. The insurance payout came first, a check for $2.8 million written when my parents reported triplet births with complications, and the accountant traced how that money moved through bank accounts and purchases. She showed the jury records of the house purchased 6 months after we were born, a house with a basement that my parents immediately renovated with soundproofing and reinforced locks. She displayed receipts for medical equipment, examination tables, testing supplies, all bought with the insurance money, and all kept in the basement where no one could see. The private school tuition for my 3 sisters cost thousands every year, paid from the same accounts that held the insurance money, and the accountant noted that no educational expenses existed for a 4th child. The prosecutor asked if the spending pattern suggested planning, and the accountant said yes, that someone had calculated exactly how to use the insurance money to maintain a hidden child while giving the visible children every advantage. My parents' lawyer objected, saying spending choices weren't proof of criminal intent, but the prosecutor showed more records, including purchases made right after my sister got sick. medical supplies that matched what would be needed for organ harvesting. The accountant explained that normal parents facing a child's illness would pay for doctors and treatment, not buy surgical equipment to use at home. And the jury looked at my parents with expressions that suggested they were understanding the full scope of the fraud. The money trail showed everything was calculated, that from the moment my parents claimed triplets instead of quadruplets, they'd been building a system to keep me hidden and ready, and every purchase, every choice, every dollar spent proved they knew exactly what they were doing. Defense witnesses started on day 8, people from our neighborhood and my parents' church, who stood up to say what good parents they were, how devoted, how active in the community. One woman talked about my mother volunteering at the school events, always smiling, always helpful, and she said she couldn't believe someone that kind would hurt a child. A man from my father's work described him as honest and hardworking, someone who cared about his family above everything, and he insisted there must be some mistake. The prosecutor stood up for cross-examination after each witness, and she asked the same question every time. Did you know about the 4th child? Every witness said no, and the prosecutor let that answer sit in the air for a moment before asking how devoted parents could hide an entire human being for 13 years. She asked the school volunteer if hiding a child seemed consistent with caring about children, and the woman stammered that she didn't know about that part. She asked my father's coworker if honest people usually commit insurance fraud and keep children in basements, and he said he only knew my father at work. After 5 witnesses, the pattern was clear. Everyone thought my parents were good people. Because my parents made sure no one saw the truth, and the prosecutor pointed out that the ability to maintain a false image for years actually proved how calculated and deliberate their deception was. The defense lawyer called one more witness, a doctor who said families sometimes make unconventional medical choices, but the prosecutor asked if keeping a child in a basement with no official medical care qualified as a medical choice, and the doctor admitted it didn't. When the defense rested, my parents' lawyer looked frustrated, and my mother stared at her hands like she'd been staring at them since the trial started. Closing arguments happened on day 9, the prosecutor standing up to summarize everything the jury had heard. She walked them through the timeline, from the moment my parents discovered they had quadruplets, through the decision to hide 1 child, and claim only 3, through 13 years of confinement and medical testing, to the night my sisters broke the window because they knew what was about to happen. She showed the photos again, the basement, the medical file, the financial records, and she said these weren't the actions of protective parents, but of people who viewed their own child as a resource to be used. She talked about the $2.8 million, how that money bought a house with a basement perfect for hiding me, how it paid for soundproofing and locks and medical equipment, how every dollar proved the fraud was planned from the start. She described the medical evidence, the tissue typing, the compatibility testing, the timeline that showed preparation for organ harvesting, and she asked the jury to consider what would have happened if 4 identical girls hadn't stood on that lawn and forced neighbors to count. The defense lawyer gave his closing argument next, claiming my parents made unconventional choices to protect a sick child, that the basement was safer than exposing me to the world, that the medical tests were monitoring. He said the insurance fraud was wrong but understandable, that parents facing overwhelming medical costs sometimes make desperate choices, and he asked the jury to consider that my parents never actually harmed me physically. The prosecutor stood up for rebuttal and said that keeping a child in a basement for 13 years was physical harm, that planning to harvest her organs was harm, that denying her identity and personhood and freedom was harm, and that the only reason I wasn't physically damaged beyond repair was because my sisters intervened before the final harm could occur. The jury left to deliberate at 3 in the afternoon, and Heather took me to a waiting room where I sat with my sisters and tried not to think about what would happen if the jury decided my parents were right. The verdict came back 6 hours later, and we filed back into the courtroom while the jury foreman stood up. The judge asked if they'd reached a verdict, and the foreman said yes, and then he read the words guilty on all major charges. Guilty of insurance fraud, guilty of child endangerment, guilty of unlawful imprisonment, guilty of conspiracy to commit assault. My father's face stayed blank, but my mother started crying quietly, and my sisters grabbed my hands on both sides. The judge thanked the jury and set a sentencing hearing for 2 weeks later, and we left the courtroom while reporters shouted questions we didn't answer. Sentencing happened on a Thursday morning, and the courtroom felt different, heavier somehow, like everyone knew this was the moment that would define consequences. The judge reviewed the charges, the evidence, the testimony, and she said my parents' actions represented a profound betrayal of parental duty and human decency. She gave my father 5 years in prison for insurance fraud and child endangerment, and my mother 4 years with credit for cooperation. Heather explained later that these were serious sentences, that most people charged with similar crimes got less time, but sitting in that courtroom listening to years that didn't match the 13 years I spent in the basement made me feel like the math was wrong. My father was let out first, and he looked at me one last time before the bailiff took him through the side door, and I couldn't read anything in his expression. My mother cried harder when they took her away, and part of me wanted to feel something. sadness or relief or anger, but mostly I felt empty. Family court happened the next week in a different building with a different judge who reviewed custody arrangements. My sisters were formally placed with their aunt who'd been taking care of them since the escape, and the judge signed papers making the adoption official. I remained with Aisha in therapeutic foster care because the judge said I needed specialized support that my sister's aunt couldn't provide, and hearing that decision felt like being separated all over again, even though I understood the reasoning. The judge explained the arrangement was temporary, that once I was stable enough, we could revisit whether I could join my sisters. But temporary felt like another word for uncertain. My sisters cried when the judge made the ruling, and their aunt promised they could visit as often as allowed. But leaving the courthouse separately hurt more than I expected. The restitution hearing came 2 days after custody was decided, and the judge ordered my parents to pay for all my medical costs, therapy expenses, and educational support going forward. The amount was huge, over $200,000, and Heather told me actually getting the money would be almost impossible since my parents had no assets left after legal fees. She said what mattered was the official acknowledgement that they owed me, that the court recognized their responsibility to pay for the damage they caused. And I tried to feel satisfied with symbolic justice, even though symbolic didn't pay for the therapy I needed 3 times a week. Aisha brought home name books during my second week back at her house after all the court proceedings finished, setting them on the kitchen table while I ate breakfast. She said I could take my time, that choosing a name was important and shouldn't be rushed, and I opened the first book to pages full of options I'd never considered. Every name felt wrong at first, too normal or too strange, and I kept second-guessing whether I liked something or just thought I should like it. Aisha suggested making a list of names that felt right, then narrowing down over time, and I wrote 10 names on paper before crossing out 9, because I couldn't trust my own choices after years of having no choices at all. I spent the next week sitting at Aisha's kitchen table with tutors who brought workbooks and practice tests, trying to fill 13 years of missing education into a brain that learned everything from textbooks my sisters smuggled down to the basement. The reading tutor smiled when I finished comprehension passages faster than she expected, telling me I was working at 10th grade level already. But the math tutor frowned at my scratch paper covered in wrong answers because I never learned multiplication tables or how fractions worked. Science was worse because the tutor kept talking about experiments and labs and hands-on learning I never experienced, asking me to explain concepts about chemistry, and physics that made no sense when all I knew came from words on pages without seeing how anything actually worked. I sat through 3-hour sessions twice a week, my head hurting from trying to understand percentages, and decimals and algebraic equations that felt like a foreign language, and the tutors kept saying I was making good progress, but I could see the concern in their faces when they marked another page of wrong answers. Aisha brought me snacks during study sessions and told me learning takes time, that nobody expected me to catch up overnight, but I wanted to catch up fast because being behind felt like another way my parents damaged me. The GED program loomed in my future like a test I wasn't ready for, and every wrong answer on practice worksheets reminded me how far I still had to go. My sister started coming every Saturday afternoon, and we sat in Aisha's living room trying to figure out how to be together without crisis or secrets driving our interactions. Melody brought movies she thought I might like, romantic comedies and superhero films I'd never seen, and we watched them on the couch while eating popcorn Katya made in the microwave. They talked about their school during commercial breaks, complaining about teachers who assigned too much homework and friends who caused drama over stupid things, and I listened trying to understand what normal teenage problems looked like. We cooked dinner together sometimes, following recipes from a cookbook Eliza found, and they showed me how to chop vegetables and measure ingredients, and use the stove without burning things. The conversation felt awkward at first because we kept avoiding topics that led back to the basement, but slowly we found safe subjects like music and books and what kinds of pizza toppings were best. I was learning what sisterhood meant outside of secret visits and whispered lessons, discovering that being family involved ordinary moments like arguing over what movie to watch or laughing when someone burned the garlic bread. They never mentioned our parents during these visits, and I appreciated that we could exist together without the weight of what happened pressing down on every word. Uncle Gary started showing up at physical therapy appointments, driving me to the clinic twice a week and waiting in the lobby while Thomas worked on my muscle development. He brought books each time. Science fiction novels and fantasy series he said were his favorites growing up, and he'd talk about the plots during the drive home like we were just uncle and niece having normal conversations. He apologized constantly those first few visits, saying he should have known something was wrong, that he visited the house for holidays and birthdays, and never thought to question why he only saw 3 girls. I didn't know how to respond to his apologies because part of me was angry he didn't notice, and part of me understood that my parents were good at hiding things. He took me out for ice cream after therapy one day, and told me stories about my father as a kid, before he became the person who locked me in a basement, and I wasn't sure if knowing my father used to be different made things better or worse. I appreciated having family who wanted to be part of my life now, but I couldn't fully forgive Uncle Gary for the years he didn't see me, and that complicated feeling sat between us during every car ride. 6 months after the night my sisters broke the window, I sat with Aisha looking through baby name books trying to choose something that felt right. Every name I read felt too normal or too strange, like putting on clothes that didn't fit, and I kept closing the books frustrated because I couldn't trust my own preferences after years of being called spare. Aisha suggested names that meant strength or freedom, but those felt too obvious, like trying too hard to rewrite what happened. I found Iris on page 43 of the third book, reading that it meant rainbow and hope, and something about that combination felt true in a way other names didn't. Aisha helped me fill out legal paperwork to petition the court for a name change, and we submitted forms that would make me a real person with documentation proving I existed. The wait for the court order took 3 weeks, and I checked the mail every day like the papers might somehow get lost. When the envelope finally arrived with official documents stating my legal identity as Iris Cannon, I cried holding the papers because my name was printed on government forms that recognized me as an actual human being with rights. Aisha hugged me while I sobbed, and I realized I was crying not just about having a name, but about finally existing in a way that couldn't be erased. Physical therapy sessions dropped from 3 times a week to twice a week, as my strength improved enough that Thomas said I didn't need constant monitoring. He measured my muscle development during each appointment, using calipers and charts to track my progress, and he showed me graphs demonstrating how my legs and arms were building mass that approached normal ranges for my age. I could walk up and down stairs without getting winded now, and I could stand for 20 minutes without my legs shaking, and these small victories felt enormous after years of barely being able to support my own weight. Thomas explained I would always have some limitations from the confinement, that my bones didn't develop quite right, and my cardiovascular system would never be as strong as it should be, but he said I was doing better than he expected when we started. He taught me exercises to do at home to maintain my progress, and he celebrated when I completed a full set of squats without assistance. The clinic started feeling less like a place where I was broken, and more like a place where I was building something new. Heather came to Aisha's house one evening to talk about long-term plans, and the 3 of us sat at the kitchen table discussing my future, like I was someone who got to have a future. Heather explained the therapeutic foster home was always meant to be temporary, that once I was stable enough, we could explore other living arrangements that might work better. She mentioned the possibility of me moving in with my sisters and their aunt when I turned 15, creating a transition plan that acknowledged my need for family connection while keeping therapy and support systems in place. Aisha said she would stay involved even after I moved out, that we could do weekly check-ins, and she would always be available if I needed help. The conversation felt strange because I was simultaneously excited about living with my sisters and terrified about leaving the safety of Aisha's house where everything was structured and predictable. We made a timeline that gave me 8 more months before the transition, and Heather said we would do trial overnight visits to make sure the arrangement would work. I signed papers agreeing to the plan, and my signature on the forms felt like another step toward being a person who made decisions about her own life. The alternative school was smaller than I expected, just 1 building with maybe 50 students total, and the principal explained they specialized in teenagers who needed different educational approaches. My first day terrified me because I'd never been around other kids my age, except my sisters, and I kept thinking everyone would stare at me or ask questions I didn't know how to answer. The teachers introduced me to the class without mentioning why I was there, and the other students barely looked up from their work, because apparently new kids showed up all the time. I sat at a desk near the back and tried to focus on the reading assignment, while my hands shook and the girl next to me asked to borrow a pencil like I was just another student instead of someone who lived in a basement for 13 years. Nobody treated me like I was strange or broken, because everyone there had their own challenges, their own reasons for needing a school that understood trauma and difference. The teachers used different methods than regular schools, lots of one-on-one instruction and flexible pacing, and they never pushed me to share more than I was ready to share. I left that first day exhausted but also relieved because maybe I could exist around other people without my past defining every interaction. My sisters and I started going to family therapy together once a week, sitting in a room with a therapist who specialized in sibling relationships affected by trauma. The first session was awkward silence until the therapist asked us to talk about what we wanted from each other, and Melody started crying, saying she felt guilty for having a normal childhood while I suffered. Katya admitted she resented that I blamed them sometimes, even though she knew it wasn't their fault, and Eliza said she was angry at our parents, but also angry at herself for not doing more sooner. I told them I loved them, and also felt resentful that they got to be people while I was just spare parts, and saying that out loud made me feel terrible but also honest. The therapist helped us understand that all these feelings could exist together, that love and resentment and guilt and anger could be true simultaneously, and that building real relationships meant acknowledging the complicated truth instead of pretending everything was fine. We worked through exercises about communication and boundaries, learning how to talk about the basement without it destroying us, and slowly we started building connections that weren't defined entirely by what our parents did. 7 months after the escape, I packed an overnight bag for my first visit to my sister's house with their aunt. The drive there made my stomach hurt because I kept imagining all the ways the visit could go wrong, all the reasons I might panic or fail at being a normal person in a normal house. Their aunt met me at the door and showed me to a guest room with windows that opened and curtains I could close, and a door with a lock on the inside. I tested the lock 3 times to make sure it actually worked, and my sisters laughed, but not in a mean way, understanding why I needed to check. We ate dinner together at a real dining table, and their aunt asked me questions about school and therapy, like she genuinely wanted to know the answers. That night, I lay in bed staring at the windows, watching streetlights through the glass, and I made it until 3 in the morning before the panic hit. I locked myself in the bathroom trying to breathe through the fear, and Melody found me there 20 minutes later and sat on the floor with me until the sun came up. We didn't talk much, just existed together while my breathing slowly returned to normal, and in the morning, their aunt made pancakes like nothing unusual had happened. I survived the overnight visit, and that felt like progress even though I spent half of it having a panic attack. GED classes started at a community center that ran programs for teenagers working toward their credentials, and I was placed in an accelerated track for students with strong reading skills, but gaps in other subjects. The instructor explained the goal was to get me ready to take the actual test by age 16, which would put me only slightly behind my sister's timeline for graduating high school. I sat in a classroom with 8 other students who were there for different reasons, dropouts and kids from alternative situations, and nobody asked why I needed a GED instead of a regular diploma. The classes covered math, science, social studies, and language arts, moving faster than regular school because everyone there was motivated to catch up. I struggled with the science sections that required understanding experiments and lab work, but the instructor gave me extra materials to study and said I was making solid progress. The math remained challenging, but I was learning to work through problems step by step instead of giving up when equations confused me. Taking the GED classes made me feel like I was moving towards something real, like maybe I could catch up to where I should have been if my parents hadn't stolen 13 years from me. Heather came to Aisha's house 2 weeks after the sentencing with papers about a victim-offender dialogue program. She explained the program let victims meet with the people who hurt them in a controlled setting, with trained people there to make sure everyone stayed safe. My parents had been moved to different prisons to start their time, and they could request these meetings if I wanted to participate. I listened to her explain how it worked, and felt my stomach twist into knots thinking about sitting in a room with my father and mother while they talked about what they did to me. Heather said I didn't have to decide right away, and that many victims found it helpful, but only if I felt ready. I told her I wasn't ready, and might never be ready, because hearing them try to explain or apologize wouldn't change the 13 years I spent in the basement. She nodded and put the papers back in her folder and said the option would stay available if I changed my mind later. After she left, I sat on Aisha's couch feeling relieved that I could say no to something and have adults respect that choice. Gary picked me up 3 days later to take me to the bank. He had all the documents we needed, including my birth certificate that the court finally issued and my social security card that arrived in the mail the week before. Walking into the bank felt strange because I'd never been inside one and didn't understand how money worked beyond the basic concept of exchange. Gary talked to someone at a desk who asked me questions about my address and my name and whether I had any money to put in the account. I pulled out $17 in cash from my pocket, money I'd earned doing small jobs around Aisha's house like organizing the garage and pulling weeds from the garden. The bank person counted it and typed things into a computer and then gave me a card with my name printed on it. Gary explained I could use the card to take money out or check my balance and that the $17 was mine to spend however I wanted. Holding that card with my name on it made me feel powerful in a way I didn't expect, because it meant I owned something and had control over it. We went to get ice cream after, and I used my card for the first time to pay for my own cone, and watching the transaction go through felt like proof I was becoming a real person who existed in the world. The alternative school planned a small party when I passed my first official test. The reading test had questions about understanding passages and finding main ideas and making connections between different texts. I finished it in 40 minutes and scored at 11th grade level, which my teacher said was really good, considering I'd only been in formal education for a few months. She asked if my sisters could come to the celebration, and I said yes, even though having them at the school made me nervous. The party happened during lunch period with cake and juice boxes and about 15 students from my classes. My sisters arrived with their aunt, and Melody brought me a card she'd picked out herself. The front said, "Proud of you," with a picture of a mountain climber reaching a summit, and inside she'd written a note about how hard I'd worked and how far I'd come. Reading her words made tears start, and I couldn't stop them from falling even though I felt embarrassed crying in front of everyone. Katya hugged me and said happy tears were good tears, and that I should be proud of myself for catching up so fast. Eliza took pictures on her phone and promised to print them, so I could keep them in my room. The other students clapped when my teacher announced my score, and several of them came over to say congratulations, like passing a test was a normal thing worth celebrating. I ate cake and talked to my sisters about their classes, and felt something close to normal for the first time since the escape. 8 months after everything happened, Heather called a meeting at Aisha's house to talk about my future. She brought papers about the transition plan we'd been discussing for weeks, and laid them out on the kitchen table. The plan said I would move in with my sisters and their aunt when I turned 15 in 1 month. Aisha would stay involved as a support person doing weekly check-ins and being available if I needed help with anything. My therapy would continue with the same person, but the sessions would happen at my sister's house instead of at Aisha's. There were backup plans written out for what would happen if living with my sisters didn't work, including the option to return to Aisha's or find a different placement. Everyone agreed the plan was worth trying because family connection mattered, and my sisters wanted me with them. I signed papers giving permission for the transition, and Aisha signed papers agreeing to stay involved, and my sister's aunt signed papers accepting responsibility for my care. Heather explained the timeline and said we'd do practice visits before the actual move to make sure I felt comfortable. Looking at all those signatures on official documents made the plan feel real, and I felt excited and scared at the same time about leaving the safety of Aisha's house where everything was structured and predictable. I decided to write a victim impact statement after my therapist suggested it might help me process what happened. The statement would go into my parents' prison records and be part of their permanent files even though they wouldn't necessarily read it. I sat at Aisha's kitchen table with blank paper and a pen and tried to find words for what it felt like to discover I wasn't loved as a daughter. I wrote about reading the medical file and understanding that my existence was only valued as spare parts for my sisters. I described the basement and the blood draws and the years of thinking that hiding meant protection. I wrote about watching my sisters on monitors and wanting to be part of their world, but knowing I never could be. The words came slowly at first, and then faster as I let myself remember and feel everything I'd been pushing down. Writing the truth about what they did to me felt like taking back my story from them and making it mine instead of theirs. When I finished 3 pages of writing, my hand hurt and my face was wet from crying, but I also felt lighter somehow. I gave the statement to Heather, and she said she'd make sure it got added to the official records, and that what I wrote was powerful and important. Family therapy reached a turning point when we all finally said what we'd been avoiding. The therapist asked us to talk about what healing meant and whether we thought we could ever be a normal family. Melody said healing didn't mean forgetting what happened or pretending the damage wasn't real. Katya agreed and said we needed to stop acting like everything was fine when it wasn't fine, and might never be completely fine. Eliza admitted she felt angry at our parents, but also angry at herself for not doing more sooner even though she was just a kid. I told them I loved them, and also felt resentful sometimes that they got to be people while I was just spare parts, and that both feelings existed together. The therapist helped us understand that we were sisters who loved each other, and also people who were harmed by the same people in different ways. She said both things could be true at the same time, and that real relationships meant accepting the complicated truth instead of pretending. We worked through exercises about talking honestly and setting boundaries and learning how to be family without ignoring what our parents did to all of us. By the end of the session, we all felt exhausted, but also closer because we'd finally stopped pretending. My 15th birthday happened 9 months after the escape, and my sisters planned a real party. They decorated their aunt's living room with streamers and balloons and invited 4 friends from my alternative school. There was a cake with my chosen name written in frosting and presents wrapped in bright paper. Everyone sang happy birthday while I stood there feeling overwhelmed by how different this was from every other birthday I'd had. Before the escape birthdays meant another year of captivity marked by my mother taking extra blood samples and my father measuring my height and weight. This birthday meant being celebrated as a person who mattered beyond my medical usefulness. My sisters gave me books and clothes and a journal for writing. My school friends gave me gift cards and candy and a stuffed animal that one of them said reminded her of me. We ate cake and played games and took pictures, and I felt joy that seemed fragile but real. When everyone left and I helped clean up, I told my sisters this was the best birthday I'd ever had, and Melody said it was just the first of many good ones to come. The move happened 2 weeks after my birthday on a Saturday morning. Gary drove me, and all my belongings fit in 3 boxes and 2 bags. My sisters had prepared a room for me with windows that had curtains I could close, and a door with a lock on the inside that only I had the key for. The closet had clothes I'd picked out myself during shopping trips with Aisha, and the dresser had space for everything I owned. My sisters helped me unpack and arrange things how I wanted them, and their aunt made lunch for everyone. That first night, I lay in bed staring at the windows and watching streetlights through the glass. Everything felt different from Aisha's house, and I couldn't sleep because my brain kept telling me something was wrong, even though nothing was actually wrong. At 3 in the morning, the panic hit hard, and I locked myself in the bathroom trying to breathe through the fear. Melody must have heard me because she knocked softly and asked if I was okay. I opened the door and she came in and sat on the floor with me until the sun came up. We didn't talk much, but she held my hand and matched her breathing to mine until I calmed down. In the morning, their aunt made pancakes like nothing unusual had happened, and I realized that living with people who understood my panic made it less scary somehow. GED preparation became part of the daily routine with tutors coming to the house 3 times a week. The goal was for me to take the actual test in 6 months, which would put me only slightly behind my sister's timeline for graduating high school. My sisters helped me study while managing their own homework, and we created a schedule where we all worked together at the dining table. Melody helped with reading and writing assignments. Katya explained science concepts using examples from everyday life. Eliza worked through math problems with me step by step until the equations made sense. Their aunt made sure we took breaks and ate snacks and didn't push too hard. Learning together felt different from them teaching down to me like they used to do in the basement. Now we were all students working toward our own goals and helping each other along the way. The tutors said I was making good progress, and that taking the test at 15 was realistic if I kept working at this pace. 10 months after the escape, I walked into my therapy session and sat down without crying or panicking. My therapist noticed right away and asked what felt different. I told her I didn't know exactly, but that coming to therapy didn't feel as hard anymore. We talked about my progress over the past months and my goals for the future and what I wanted my life to look like. She asked about my sense of self and whether I still saw myself mainly as a victim. I thought about it and said I was starting to see myself as a person who had been hurt, but was also building something new. She wrote notes and said I was developing real hope about my life, which was a big change from our early sessions when I couldn't imagine a future at all. We discussed my relationships with my sisters and how living together was going, and what I wanted to work on next in therapy. When the session ended, I walked out feeling calm instead of drained, and realized that healing was actually happening even though I couldn't always see it day to day. Gary picked us up on Saturday morning in his old truck that barely fit 4 identical teenagers. We drove 20 minutes to the Natural History Museum while he asked about school and our week and normal uncle questions that still felt strange because I'd only known him for 10 months. The museum had wide steps leading up to glass doors and people everywhere moving in groups and families. Melody grabbed my hand when we walked inside, and I felt my breathing speed up from all the noise and movement and open space. A woman at the ticket counter stared at us while Gary paid, and I watched her eyes move from face to face, counting and recounting like she couldn't believe what she was seeing. We walked through the dinosaur exhibit first, and people kept turning to look at the 4 of us standing in a row reading about fossils and extinction events. A little kid pointed and asked his mom why there were 4 of the same girl, and she shushed him but kept staring too. Katya made a joke about being clones, and Eliza laughed, and I realized people were staring because we were interesting now instead of evidence. Nobody here knew about the basement or the trial or what our parents did. They just saw 4 identical girls being sisters at a museum on a Saturday. We spent 2 hours looking at exhibits and eating lunch in the cafeteria and taking a group photo that Gary insisted on. Walking back to the truck, I felt tired but good, and I thought about how being a quadruplet used to mean I was the hidden one, but now it meant I belonged to something visible. The community college prep program started 3 weeks later with classes twice a week at the local campus. I sat in a classroom with 12 other students working toward their GED, and the teacher explained the spring test schedule and requirements. My sisters helped me study every night at the kitchen table in the house we all shared now with their aunt, who gave us space and structure and normal family dinners. No basement, no secrets, no medical files by anyone's bed. Just 4 sisters doing homework and arguing about whose turn it was to do dishes and planning what we'd study the next day. I picked the name Iris because it meant hope, and I needed to believe in that even when the nightmares came or the panic attacks hit, or I remembered what it felt like to read those words about being spare parts. Melody still woke me up sometimes when I was crying in my sleep, and Katya made sure I ate when anxiety killed my appetite, and Eliza reminded me to breathe when everything felt too big. They fought to get me out, and now they were fighting to help me build something. The GED test was scheduled for April, and passing meant I'd be only 1 year behind them graduating high school. The trauma didn't disappear when I chose my name or moved into a real bedroom or started going to classes, but I was building a life now where I got to choose what happened next, and that mattered more than I knew how to explain.